This is, mostly without a doubt, the worst modern engine ever produced. Before we get to it though, we're gonna take a look at all of its runner-ups. Which is to say, here are 15 engines you should avoid at all costs. And we're gonna break down why this one might be the ultimate suck. Let's go!
What makes an engine bad? Well, a bad engine might be hard to work on, or it might be really unreliable due to bad design. Heck, it might even be that the entire engine is totally let down by one part, or sometimes all of the above.
In the case of the BMW N63, it's all of the above. Which is an absolute shame, because on paper, it's an amazing engine. It's got 8 cylinders, 2 turbos, and they can absolutely scream. In practice, the turbos are in a terrible spot. They heat up and radiate said heat onto parts that shouldn't be heated. They leak coolant and oil. The valve train is weak sauce. What oil they don't leak gets sucked in and burned off from a bad PCV design, faulty valve stem seals, or both. Then they just straight up blow up when they get starved of oil, which is a common problem. And performing repairs on this thing will make you want to yeet the car into space. After you find out you need a special tool to replace the special part you just spent your entire life savings on.
BMW doesn't have a monopoly on badly made turbocharged engines though. It does seem to be a common German problem. My theory is that they just over-engineer everything. And forget that us mere mortals are not super geniuses working in clean rooms. That and the 10,000 or sometimes even 15,000 mile oil change intervals is a joke if you want the thing to last past 100,000 miles.
Anyway, the Volkswagen 2-liter TSI, used in a ton of V-dubs and Audis between 2006 and 2014, is a decent enough engine, as long as nothing ever goes wrong. The super cool direct fuel injectors, though, will probably go wrong. And personally, having worked on a boatload of these, just like the Felicity Ace, which was the ship that sank, carrying 4,000-ish VW Group cars, the 2-liter TSI will sink your bank account. Because what will go wrong is the water pump, or the timing chain tensioner, or the ignition coils, or the turbocharger, or the high-pressure fuel pump, or the self-machining camshafts.
8 hours later.
Or the piston rings, or the PCV valve, or... You get the picture, I think. When it's working, it's great. But honestly... You ever hear the joke about Subaru drivers? How you don't know if they're just vaping, or if their engine just ate another head gasket?
Well, that joke comes from the fact that EJ engines, the flat 2-liter and 2.5-liter Subaru masterpieces, have a problem getting oil and coolant where it needs to be.
Subaru admitted to the issue in 2002, they just never actually fixed it. They just instead stopped making the EJ and replaced it with the FB, an engine that has the same goddamn issue. And buyer beware, it comes in the Forester, Legacy, and Outback. Am I crazy for thinking the Crosstrek looks good lifted? Is that... Cause guess what, it comes in that too. Anyways, come on Subaru, I want to love you, but you make it so hard sometimes. People often make fun of GM for being stuck in the past. It took them decades to make a mid-engine car, and even then, their flagship Corvette still uses an ancient pushrod engine, while the rest of the civilized world started switching to overhead cams in the 80s. There's a good reason for that though, because when GM did try to make an overhead cam V8, which they called the Northstar engine, found in Cadillacs during the 90s and early 2000s, it was a catastrophe. They were way too complicated and hard to fix, which they needed all the time since the head bolts would rip themselves out of the blocks and kill the engine for good. Something like replacing a simple starter? Yeah, it leaves underneath the intake manifold. It's an all-day job. And that's all just the tip of the iceberg. GM blamed the owners for not doing enough maintenance, but quietly discontinued the design in the mid-2000s and never revisited it. Kia and Hyundai have both made huge strides in the past decade, and if I'm honest, the Vision N74 is a fuel cell vehicle that even I think is cool.
However, their electric future can't come fast enough, since the 4-cylinder engines they put in everything, the Theta series 2-liter and 2.4-liter lumps, are apparently piles of hot garbage.
Seriously, try to Google it. The first entries are all how to tell when your Hyundai/Kia engine is failing. Not if. There's not a question of if, it's when. I don't have a ton of personal experience with these engines, and I don't want to sit here and badmouth the company based on just what you read on the internet. However, the search results are pretty telling, I think.
When coolant and oil mix, it creates this awful sludge that gets everywhere inside an engine and causes all sorts of issues. It doesn't cool and it doesn't lubricate. It just makes a mess and ruins things. Chrysler's 2.7-liter V6 was so famous for having water pump gasket issues that the nickname for the engine is Sludge Factory. The water pump is driven internally off the timing chain, and a small paper gasket is all that stood in the way from the coolant circulating through the cooling system like it should, or just being circulated right into the oil pan. And it resulted in one of the biggest recalls in US automotive history.
The real kicker is that there was no upside. The engine barely made enough power to move the chargers and C-rings that they came with, so you got a shitty engine that would eventually shit itself. Remember the Northstar we talked about earlier? Well, that was GM's second colossal failure trying to adapt to modern ideas. The first was when they took their 350 small block, which was a great engine, and turned it into a diesel.
Yes, really, someone at Oldsmobile thought it was a great idea. The reality is that it was slow, weighed way too much,
and here's a little secret GM didn't know apparently, but diesel engines require way higher compression ratios, so they need to be built way stronger.
Block damage was so common on the Oldsmobile diesel engines that it was more common to find an 80s GM diesel converted to a gasser than one that still had the original engine.
Okay, this one will be quick because when it comes to Toyota, 99.9% of the time, they can do no wrong. But the 3VZFE, nicknamed the 3-point slow, is that 0.1%. It's underpowered, especially since they insisted on sticking it in the heavy 4Runners of the early 90s. And if you look at it funny, the head gaskets disintegrate. The Ideal Garage used to have a 92 that sat for years, just because after the third head gasket, no one had the energy to fix it again. GM has made a ton of truly amazing engines. The LS1 is simply one of the best ever built, and nothing is as iconic in the muscle car world as the legendary Big Block 7.4 454, the Big Block. But they also made a lot of absolute turds, which is why they have the most entries on today's list. This time with the Ecotec 1.4, the thing in the Cruise and the Sonic. It's a turbo, which is cool, except the turbo oil feed and return lines like to coke up, plug, run the spoily boy right out of oil, and fail, which is awful. And it's cheaper to replace the whole engine than just replace the turbo and everything that goes along with it. That's not cool. Oh, Ford. The Explorer was the best-selling car of its time, and every part of it was a flaming pile of crap. The tires were bad, the suspension killed people, and the Cologne V6... I have never seen an engine so obsessed with eating its own timing chains, until a couple friends started buying used Exploders to do off-roading in. Look, I don't usually touch Ford unless it's an old Mustang or maybe a Crown Vic, so I never really knew how terrible their V6 line was. Looking back, I honestly have no idea how the Explorer stuck around as long as it did. Okay, last GM, I swear. It's also the last American V6, since I think we've straight up hit all of them. The GM 3600 V6 is actually a great engine. Keep the oil topped up and torque down the upper intake bolts every so often, they'll run forever. The newer 3.6 VVT engines though, you know, the one used in things like the Traverse, and the Cadillac CTS, it can't be saved. The timing chain will wear, elongate, and break, assuming the water pump holds out long enough for that to happen, which it won't. You like overheating aluminum heads, right? Okay, so most of you will never get to experience this engine, but it has to be on a list of bad engines. The one and only Hugo. It's a small, terrible car built in Yugoslavia, and it's one of the worst cars ever. I think we've said that before. It's really only surpassed by the Trabant in terms of sheer awfulness.
But the Trabant might actually have a better engine. Both cars are truly horrendously unreliable, and somehow get terrible gas mileage despite being smaller than most weed whackers. The Hugo takes the win, or lose, because somehow, against all odds and logic, it makes less power than the Trabant.
It's a good thing we've moved on from inefficient, unreliable engine designs. Here's a question for you. What has apex seals, sounds like a mob of angry bees, and makes less power than a Civic Si, all while burning more fuel? It's the Renesis, found in the Mazda RX-8. The 13B in the RX-7 wasn't exactly reliable or amazing, but with a big honkin' turbo, it was at least good for speed. Somehow, the follow-up 13B MSP Renesis was never able to make the power it needed to make up for the lack of reliability and efficiency. I wouldn't say it's the worst engine ever. Rotaries definitely have their place and their charm, but I also would strongly recommend not owning one if you like actually driving your car. JLR stands for Jaguar Land Rover, which means you'll find this 5-liter V8 in Jags, Land Rovers, and Range Rovers, and it sucks. Ask me how I know. Honestly, if the water pump lasts 20,000 miles, that's a miracle. It also means the car is probably about to explode, since I'm convinced the electrical system is set to self-destruct after 100 hours of use. And I like fixing them, because anyway, one last engine. I promised you the worst engine, and it's a surprise, or probably not a surprise because it comes from Ford. I honestly don't know how this engine exists. It was developed when we had computer modeling. It was built using the bones of one of the most reliable engines in the world, and it was commissioned by one of the richest car companies ever. But somehow, the Ford 5.4-liter V8, aka the 3-valve, aka the Triton V8, is just the worst. When's the last time this happened to you? You're driving down the road, and the goddamn spark plugs just break out of the cylinder heads and launch through the hood. That's a thing that happens when you have a pre-2013 Ford 3-valve. Oh, but Trav, you say, you can just fix the thread problems. Sure, Ford even supplied the new threads, but guess what? The new threads would fuse with the aluminum heads and expand at different rates, and then you'd break the plugs off during routine maintenance. Sprinkle in some of that Chrysler sludge and some Ford standard timing chain problems, exhaust manifolds that like to crack and break, variable valve timing actuators that plug up and fail, and my God, this came in the best-selling truck in America. I need a Snickers. Anyway, here's what the comments are gonna be. But Trav, I had a Kia Rio with the Theta and it ran forever, etc., etc. I'm not discounting your experience, but you should consider yourself lucky. Let me know if you have any experience with any of these engines. I want to hear about it. Go check out some of our other content, and as always, keep living the ideal lifestyle.